Thank you for coming to the second lecture of the Azusa Pacific Seminary Hispanic Theology Lectures. It's a privilege to introduce Reverend Dr. Carlos Emilio Ham. He's a double doctor, right? Two doctors, one from Austin Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary in Texas, and then his PhD from the Free University of Amsterdam. He is the president of the Seminario Evangélico de Teología in Matanzas, Cuba. He was born in Cuba, but spent much of his youth in the U.S., and then his family moved back to Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Quote, he returned to Cuba against the traffic because 80% of the seminary graduates and 70% of Presbyterian pastors had left the country. And so the Hams, Carlos's dad, went back. And they had many opportunities to go back to America. His father said that they needed to serve the churches in Cuba. Dr. Ham is a pastor of the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Cuba, has served as its general secretary for 8 years. He has led SET, that is the seminary, since 2015. And prior to that, he served the World Council of Churches in Geneva for 13 years. And the focus of his studies have been on empowering diaconia. He's also friends with people in my family. His dad ministered with my great aunt Elsa in Cuba. And so it's an honor to have him here talk to us about Cuban missiology, especially Cuban Protestant missiology in a pre-revolutionary era, the end of the 19th century to 1958, right when the revolution kind of begins. So let's give a warm welcome to Reverend Dr. Carlos Emilio Ham.
Buenas tardes. Many Spanish-speaking friends over here. Dear brothers and sisters and friends, both Tanya, my wife, and myself, we are very grateful for the opportunity of visiting you. We have been in the south of California for about 20 times. I have two sisters living here, and we have driven through in the freeway. We saw several times the sign, Azusa City, Azusa Pacific University, and it's really a great privilege for us to be here. And we are very grateful to our brother Brian for the generous invitation to share with you during this couple of days. As he mentioned, I will try to share with you a presentation or a lecture on the Cuban Protestant missiology in what we call the pre-revolutionary era. That means from the end of the 19th century up until 1958, 59, when the Cuban Revolution triumphed. It was on the 1st of January of 1959. So I would like for us to see this presentation in two parts. This first lecture, and then the second one tomorrow. One of the things that I have learned with Americans is to do marketing and advertising. So if you want to get a full understanding of the whole picture, full picture, I invite you to come tomorrow, which, by the way, the lecture tomorrow is going to be, as Professor Miguel said this afternoon, in the language of the angels. You know which is the language of the angels? Español. Español. So, we will deal tomorrow with the second part in the Cuban Protestant missiology in the revolutionary era. So we will study in the next following minutes the purposes and outcomes of the Christian missions in our country, in Cuba, from the perspective of the mainline historical Protestant churches. That means the churches that followed the tradition of Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, which, by the way, last year we were commemorating its half a millennium. Our intention here then is to focus more on the missiological aspect rather than on the actual history of Protestant missions in our country. So again, we have divided this presentation in 2 lectures. The second one in the period that basically Tanya and I have lived since I was 2 years old when the Cuban Revolution triumphed. It's important to acknowledge from the very beginning the very close historical and geographical ties between Cuba and the USA. Our brother, Professor Miguel de la Torre, mentioned in the previous lecture about this. Different moments, Jose Marti, our national hero and poet, he came to Tampa, to the States, to prepare what he called the necessary war that fought against the Spanish colony. Fidel Castro himself, he came to Florida in the 1950s before the triumph of the revolution to get support. So we will see that it's very important, this close connection between our both countries. And for me personally, this is part of my own history. Since my mother was from West Virginia, she was an American Baptist missionary that served in Cuba. And my father is a Cuban pastor. I was born in Cuba. I was raised, as Professor Bryan said, I was raised in the States, and therefore myself, that is my own experience. To a certain extent, I am also a Cuban American. Normally, when in Cuba, we refer to the Cuban Americans, we refer to the Cuban exiles that live in the States, particularly in Miami. But I am also a Cuban American that live in Cuba. Since English is not my mother tongue, but rather my mother's tongue, quite often I try to find words in the dictionary to look at the specific meaning of the words. And if you look up the word exile, you find basically 2 definitions. An exile, it is a state or a period of forced absence from one's country or home. And this is the generalized meaning that we have. I repeat, the state of a period of force, I underscore force, absence from one's country or home. But there is a second acception which I discovered in the dictionary. It's similar. It says, exile can also be the state or a period of a voluntary absence from one's country and home. So one of the experiences that we had when we were serving in the World Council of Churches in Geneva, we were living as exiles, but in the second sense, in the voluntary case, because it is true, as Tanya, my wife, said in the previous lecture, in the moment of the discussion, even when we have lived, we lived for about 15 years in Geneva, even when I worked with the council for 13 years, we always felt as a foreigner in Geneva. We had that so close connection with our country that we never lost, and every time that we went to Cuba, we had the feeling that we were coming home, even when it was for 1 or 2 weeks, and when we returned back to Geneva, even when it was for 12 months, or 11, 12 months, we had always the feeling that we were going to a foreign country. So this is a similar situation that we have in the relationships historically between the USA and Cuba. I remember, particularly after the revolution process, when diplomatic relationships between our both countries were broken, and the U.S. embargo was imposed on our country. There was this type of hatred and love relationship. And as someone has said, the contrary of love is not lack of love. It is hatred. I mean, hatred also is like an expression of love. I remember we received some years ago in our country the visit of an orchestra, and at the end of the concert, the director of the orchestra turned around to the public and he told us, the relationship between our both countries is like the love affair between Romeo and Juliet. They loved each other even when their parents, in this case both US and Cuban governments, were hating each other. They loved each other. It's important to bear in mind this very close, I repeat, historical, not only geographical, but also historical relationships in order to understand a bit better what we would like to share. So I will subdivide this first lecture in 4 parts. First, what we call the Patriotic Period, that goes from 1883 to 1898. Second period, the introduction of the U.S. Missionary Boards, going from 1898 to 1909. The third period that we call the Interdenominational Cooperation, from 1909 to 1940. And finally, the institutional and social development from 1941 to 1958. And please don't be worried. I'm not going to speak as long as to cover all these periods. I'm just going to take you through them just for us to have an idea of how what we call the Protestant Missiology took place and evolved in Cuba. In the article, The Patriotic Missionaries, written by one of our former Presbyterian Cuban pastors, who is also a historian, was a historian, he's already deceased, historian of our church, Rafael Cepeda. He referred to the first missionaries in Cuba as the Patriotic Missionaries. And he called them Patriotic Missionaries because these were Cuban patriots, most of them lay people, who, struggling against the Spanish colony, had to flee the country, basically because they were persecuted politically. And many of them, some of them were Catholic, some of them were Baptist in the Catholic Church. And while they were in the States, they were converted to Christianity in the Protestant tradition. So many of them returned to Cuba, and one of the first things that they did was precisely to found the first Protestant congregations in the second half of the 19th century. And I have a whole bunch of names here and of different denominations and congregations that they founded, and I'm not going to read them now, but you can have the text later on. According to the Cuban historian Marcos Antonio Ramos, who has lived in this country for many years, he says, and I quote, "The providence had allowed the presence of very special circumstances of Protestantism to enter Cuba into the arms of the country's own people and not foreign missionaries, as would happen in other Ibero-American nations." End of quote. I can mention, just to put an example, the founder of our church, we belong to the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Cuba. The first Cuban Presbyterian congregation was founded on the 26th of June of 1890 by Evaristo Collazo, one of the missionary patriots. He was a patriot, the struggle against the Spanish colony. He came to the States. He was converted to Christianity according to the Presbyterian tradition. And he was so committed and so inspired by this way of being church that he returned to Cuba and he founded the first congregation in Havana together with his wife Magdalena. As he founded the first congregation, she founded a school for particular young girls that could not afford to pay for the other schools. So we can highlight, I would say, 3 basic characteristics of these missionary patriarchs that I would like to highlight. And it's important to emphasize that because the church that we are today, the mainline historical Protestant churches that we are today, have to do to great extent with what we inherited from these missionary patriots. First of all, they were patriotic. These missionaries expressed a deep devotion and a vigorous support for the Cuban nation, fighting against the Spanish colony. Together with the planting of new Christian communities, they also inaugurated schools and clinics. In most cases, they were very progressive, according to the conservative Roman Catholic environment in which we were living at that time, which was the case to a great extent in many Latin American countries. Secondly, they were laity-driven. Most of them, the great majority of these patriarch missionaries were lay people. They were not ordained. And they began their work founding congregations in Cuba as unordained ministers, which reaffirms the fact that this sacerdotal role of the church is not confined to the clergy, but it has been entrusted to the whole people of God, the laos, from which the word laity comes, in order to spread the good news of the gospel. This relevant role of the laity has played a historical role in the mission, Christian mission of the Protestant churches, that has been very significant up until our current days. The fact that our churches today are vibrantly proclaiming the good news of the gospel and of God's mission in our country, it has to do to great extent with the commitment of these missionary patriarchs. And just to give you an example, in the case of Evaristo Collazo, again, the founder of the Presbyterian of our denomination, he started as a lay person and he asked for support from the churches here in the U.S., and the Presbyterian Church sent a missionary that was stationed in Mexico, and he traveled to Cuba, and he ordained Evaristo Collazo. His name was Anthony Graybill. He ordained, the Presbyterians are very picky for the pastors to be well formed. They have to go through the seminary in order to be ordained. And Anthony Graybill saw the commitment of Evaristo Collazo and his wife in such a way that even when he did not have any formal theological training, he laid his hands on him and he ordained him after after he founded not only this congregation, but he went throughout the island to found other congregations again. So I mentioned I'm highlighting three characteristics. The first one, they're patriotic. Secondly, they were lay people. And thirdly, they were ecumenical. Third important characteristic. So facing a so-called common adversary, this is the Roman Catholic Church, which from the very beginning also blessed the Spanish colony. These patriotic missionaries were very ecumenical. They were very close to each other, working in collaboration and avoiding competition among each other. So when the American missionaries came with the U.S. intervention starting in 1898, they found this ecumenical spirit. But the interesting thing is, and I'm moving now to the second phase, the introduction of the U.S. missionary boards. Almost any of these missionaries recognized the work of these patriotic missionaries. The work basically was interrupted because of the war of José Martí, what he called the necessary war. The missionary work was interrupted by the nationals, and then the missionaries came together with the U.S. intervention, and again they started to found new congregations, and that is the reason why in many Protestant churches the history of the Protestant missions is counted after the American missionaries came, and not necessarily at the end of the previous 18th century, where the missionary patriarchs inaugurated these new Protestant congregations. So in 1898, the U.S. government intervened in Cuba after various wars of independence between Cuban and the Spanish colony. A Swiss church historian, Jean-Pierre Bastien, underscores the following, and I quote, "Undoubtedly, after the Spanish colonization, American colonialism promoted Protestantism as a religious ideology that had to be combined with capitalism, democracy, technological progress, and education." In Cuba, Protestant denominations contributed to the progressive Americanization of their religious and pedagogical models, end of quote. A Cuban theologian, Adolfo Ham, who happens to be my father, in his article, well, let me back up 1 second. The Cuban churches have organized in the 1980s and 1990s 3 consultations, missiological consultations, to analyze all the work of the inauguration of the different missions in Cuba, both done by the Cuban nationals, the patriotic missionaries and the American missionaries. And this article, written by Adolfo Ham, was a paper that he submitted to in this consultation that later on was published in a book edited by Rafael Cepeda that I quoted earlier. And the title of his article and his presentation was La herencia misionera protestante cubana vista desde una perspectiva ecuménica. The Cuban Protestant missionary heritage viewed from the ecumenical perspective. And there, Adolfo Ham assesses the U.S. missionary enterprise, taking into account the following factors. Number 1, and I quote, "All ideological analysis is based on a political point of view that is assumed, and our analysis must be critical of all the role of the USA, all the role that the USA has played in our history and that of Latin America, from the origins of our struggles of independence into the years of our socialist revolution. On this regard, we have to be faithful to the heritage of the anti-imperialist tradition, of the forgers of our nationality, and the independence of our forefathers, like notably José Martí, who was also quoted earlier by Professor Miguel de la Torre, who strongly opposed the thesis of Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, who understood modernization and progress of our republics by imitating the European nations in the US and repudiating the Creole as barbarian. Secondly, a second question is to clarify to what extent the missionary enterprise is in line or in relation to the so-called messianism and the doctrine of the manifest destiny of the USA. We think that these meticulous case studies that have been done in the US could provide some of the conclusive answers. End of quote. And then on this regard, Adolfo goes on to point out that we can draw the following conclusions with regard to the missionary involvement in this period. And I will try to skip a little bit my paper, which pretty much is in line of these two first conclusions that I mentioned. So Adolfo concludes that, I quote, "The original sin of the Cuban Protestantism mission was to copy absolutely not only the organization of the U.S. churches, but also their middle class ideology." He ends quoting his presentation, Pastor Jacques Rossel, a Swiss missionary for many decades, who refers to three classical impediments of all missionaries, namely, number one, the colonial sin, secondly, the wealth, and thirdly, knowledge and expertise which lead to self-sufficiency. Almost by inexorable law, the U.S. missionaries did not escape from these three contradictions, end of quote. So now we move to the third phase, the interdenominational cooperation. And basically, here I'm going to mention that in 1941, the Cuban Council of the Churches was founded by the mainline historical churches, Protestant churches, as a way of bringing together the different denominations to work towards the betterment of the Cuban reality. As a result of that, among other fruits, was the founding of our seminary, Seminario Evangélico de Teología en Matanzas, in 1946, as a commitment of the leaders of the churches to form theologically the new pastors and the new theologians, to form them not confessionally, but ecumenically. So that is the reason why our seminary was founded 72 years ago. It's important to mention, you can read it later, in 1929, there was a very important Congress, a mission, Hispanic American Congress that took place in Havana. where there was important inputs from the Protestant tradition, from our country as well. So, and then in this period of time, many schools were built, many clinics. There was a strong participation of the Protestant churches and of the national mission boards, and this is very interesting. The expansion of the Protestant churches in the first half of the 20th century was carried out by the Board of National Missions of the churches here in the States, and not necessarily by the boards of foreign missions, which gives us an idea that Cuba, as it is the case of Puerto Rico, at that time was still considered American territory. In fact, all of the Cuban Protestant churches were part organically of the so-called mother churches in the USA. And as we will see in the second lecture tomorrow, with the breaking of the diplomatic relationships between our both countries and the imposition of the US embargo, that affected tremendously the work of our churches. And then the final phase, in order to end, in order to have some time for discussions and try to answer some questions, was what is understood or known as the institutional and social development from the 1941 to 1958. And basically, in that period of time, sorry, I skipped the other part because of the time, is where the huge amount of institutions and church buildings and properties, both sanctuaries and social institutions, were built in order, from a liberal point of view, in order to help basically the population in need that could not afford to pay the services. So, as a matter of conclusion, we as Protestant Cuban churches are very grateful for our history and heritage. We thank God for the founders of our churches in the 19th century, again, the Cuban Patriot missionaries, mostly lay people who were committed both to sharing the good news of the gospel ecumenically, and at the same time, they were struggling for the independence and the sovereignty of our nation. At the same time, we are grateful to the U.S. missionaries who served in our country as well. As Rafael Cepeda, that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, has pointed out, and I quote him, "We are convinced that above all the errors recognizable in all, and even over the censorable actions that can be and should be attributed to some of the missionaries, there will always be a balance in favor of those men and women who served as missionaries in our country at the beginning of the century by the principle of honesty. They said and they did the best they could to say and do according to the time in which they lived, the training they received, and the efforts that they brought, that they shared. There was, without any doubt, a basic good faith, a noble intent, a laudable purpose. These ingredients came also, without a doubt, in clay jars, where they also contain the wrong perspective or the limitation of the approach and the prejudices. But there is always a substantial asset, because they've tried to complete the biblical message that everything that comes to our hand, we should do it according to our strength. And Cepeda concludes, in addition to the presentation of the gospel in the Protestant style, which most of those missionaries did with great dedication and fervor, thus favoring the religious life of many Cubans who became sincere believers, and he himself, Cepeda, was he was converted to Christianity through the American missionaries. One must recognize, he goes on to say, another positive influence from the U.S. missionaries, the sense of order, discipline, self-control, and self-demand, cleanness of mind, body, and feeling. All in virtues not imposed by the rod or the whip, but rather by the spirit of pleasant tillage and an environment of mutual respect and fraternal relations. So we are, as Cuban Protestants today, we are very grateful to the heritage that we have received for the church that we are today. On the one hand, being founded by the Cuban Patriotic missionaries, and then in the 20th century by the American missionaries that left the best of their lives in order to share the gospel in our country. I am a son of an American missionary, and I remember very well the best time of the life of my mother when she left her. She spent the best part of her life as a young person serving in our country and renouncing to the American way of life precisely to live the gospel and to spread the gospel in our country. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you could understand my Spanglish.
You mentioned Juan Sarmiento. Sarmiento was one of the presidents of Argentina, and in the last 15 years, but new literature has been coming out from Argentina regarding not only Sarmiento, but Rosas and others that dealt in a very discriminative way against blacks and criollos, as they would call them. Would you care to elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes, in this particular case, I was quoting what Professor Rafael Cepeda was mentioning. I think what Sarmiento was trying to promote was what many missionaries, not only from the US, but also from Europe, brought. This feeling of superiority, an imperialist way of bringing the gospel, which we started to see, of course, since the Spanish colony 500 years ago, where the cross was brought together with the sword, and the Christianity, the evangelization was tried to carry it out together with the sword, no? Disregarding the spiritualities and the capacity, of the national people in their spiritualities. We see that from the Catholic missionaries, but we see it from the American missionaries. Not only that, during the first half of the 20th century, even today, we continue to receive missionaries, and I'm sorry, I call them mercenaries, because some of them come with a lot of money and with a paternalistic approach. We will talk more about that tomorrow in the second lecture when we talk about the Revolutionary period, when they bring a lot of money, and many of them disregard all this heritage that I am mentioning, no? The the indigenous spirituality, the capacity of the Cubans to carry out the mission in our country. It's a completely disregard for what they find, no? And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, there are other missionaries that came with a spirit of collaboration as well, because many of them were liberals and open-minded. So we find both, I would say both cases, both types of missionaries.
A lot of my family in Cuba ended up going to Puerto Rico for their seminary education, Presbyterian seminary education. Where does that fit in the history of that? I mean, it's kind of pre-seminary Matanzas. And how did they kind of, that theological education, why, I mean, it seems like Puerto Rico was really important in forming Cuban ministers.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Before 1946, when our seminary was founded, basically the Cuban Presbyterian pastors went to study theology to Puerto Rico. We have at least three Cuban Presbyterian pastors, that apart from bringing their theological degree from Puerto Rico, they also brought their wives. No? They married Puerto Rican girls, and they came back to Cuba. So thank you for that question, Brian, because really the Seminario Evangélico de Puerto Rico, which was and still is an ecumenical seminary, pretty much helped to form the founding of our seminary in 1946, no? And in fact, many of these pastors that studied in Puerto Rico, they became professors in the newly formed seminary in 1946. And ever since, we have had a lot of close collaboration, even today, between our both seminaries of Matanzas and Puerto Rico.
So you mentioned the indigenous spirituality, and you also mentioned the desire to, or the recognition of the paternalism of some of the missionaries. Paint a picture for us of the way that plays out in Cuban Protestant Christianity today. What does this indigenous Cuban spirituality look like on its feet as it's worked out in churches all over Cuba?
Thank you. When I was referring to indigenous spirituality, basically I was referring to the spirituality of other Latin American countries. The Cuban indigenous population was practically wiped out by the Spanish colony. The Cuban indigenous, they were forced to a very strong labor, first to try to find gold, and secondly to work in the sugarcane plantations, and they could not resist physically the situation. That situation, which is the reason why the Spaniards brought the African slaves in the first place. We have some indication about that because there was one of the indigenous rebels, Hatuey, that they burned him alive. No, they tied him in a pole, and before burning him, the Roman Catholic priest came, according to the tradition, and asked him, "Do you want for your soul to go to heaven?" And he asked, "Does your souls, as Spaniards, do they go to heaven?" Of course, they're going to go to heaven. Okay, so if your souls are going to heaven, I don't want to go to that place. And then they burned him alive. But in other Latin American countries, where there's still strong indigenous spirituality, the more conservative churches, the approach of their spirituality is to convert them to Christian tradition according to the Western tradition. There are other attempts of national theologians and pastors to elaborate on a theology that is in dialogue with their indigenous spirituality. Now, I think, as I understood your question, it's more related to today, no? When we talk about indigenous spirituality, and I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow. One of the advantages of the embargo, I would say, at the beginning of the revolution, was that we were forced to create our own theology, a contextual theology, to prepare our own liturgy. We pretty much received the liturgy from the American missionaries, by which we had to sing the hymns with the piano or with the organ. And what we tried to do was to introduce the African drums and the Cuban guitar to work on liturgical renewal, not only renewal according to the music and the rhythm, but also according to the theology, no? Based on a theology that is based on the Cuban reality of the Cuban people and their struggle, in their frustrations, but at the same time in their different dreams, no? When the American missionaries left and the diplomatic relationships were broken, then the Cuban churches were more free to elaborate this type of what we would call an indigenous theology and an indigenous liturgy that has been, I think, an important contribution that other churches abroad appreciate.
Thank you, Carlos. Trying to think of the first Protestant conference in Latin America, Panama, 1916.
1916.
Yeah. And the fact that was kind of an interesting conference, right? Because it was in El Canal de Panama, specifically years after the canal was built, with a lot of help from the United States and a lot of help of independence, from the Gran Colombia. But anyway, it took another conference, which happened in La Habana, actually, to make it a little more Latin Americanist, because the first one was in Latin America, but it wasn't from Latin America, so to speak. So, and from there on, the questions that I have is, do you see any trace of building a more autonomous approach to missions, to ecclesiology, to church, and to culture, even before the revolution? And I would like to add that at least some of us see two processes that are happening in Latin America and as a whole. One is Protestantization of the continent, and the other one is democratization of the continent. Those two are forces that are coming on the Pan-Americanism, the idea of Pan-Americanism, that already Martí was a witness in 1890s already in Washington. So we have a lot of connections there. But the question goes to, do you see traces of a more indigenous or autonomous, let's put it autonomous approach to mission, to culture, to religion, to the experience of religion in Cuba before the revolution and the embargo, where that's a different story, you have to do it. But before, you didn't have to, you were simply trying to create something.
Thank you, Oscar, for your question. It's interesting. If you look at the evolution of global missiology, the first attempt, I would say the first expression of the global ecumenical movement was in 1910 in the Edinburgh Mission Conference. At that time, there were missionaries, it's very interesting, missionaries of all over. They came to Edinburgh to celebrate the first mission conference. That was an ecumenical effort of spreading the news ecumenically. Interestingly enough, nobody came from Latin America, because, well, the purpose of the conference was how to evangelize the whole world in one generation. That was the main motto of the 1910 Edinburgh Conference. Nobody came from Latin America, because Latin America was considered a Christian continent because of the very strong Roman Catholic presence. And the American missionaries that were serving in Latin America were not happy with that approach. And then that's the reason why in New York, a number of congresses, mission congresses, were organized. The first one was, as you mentioned, in Panama, 1916, organized by American missionaries, and that conference was entirely in English. It was like a conference to be held in the US, but it was held in Panama. The second Congress was held in 1924 in 1924 in Uruguay, where there was a stronger influx and contribution of the more Latin American missiologists and missionaries. And then the third conference was precisely the one that you mentioned in Havana, 2009. Sorry, 1909. Sorry, 1929. 1929. Panama 16, Uruguay 24, and then Havana 29, which was completely in Spanish, with a small participation of American missionaries, and it was completely in Spanish. So you can see throughout the years a process by which Latin American theologians and missiologists and missionaries were taking over. And we see completely that trend. We see up until today, you have the whole concept of Misión Integral of Padilla, no? A holistic approach of mission. An important Latin American missiologist that have made a lot of contributions to the understanding of mission. And many of the many of the U.S. missionaries in Latin America have appreciated very much the important inputs of these Latin American missiologists that has expanded tremendously. At least in the mainline historical Protestant churches, many of them are ecumenical, and they're committed to sharing mission and evangelism ecumenically, in collaboration and not in competition against each other.
Sadly, I will not be able to join you tomorrow, but perhaps you're going to address this tomorrow. You mentioned ecumenical, you mentioned non-competitive. I'm wondering if you could share with us what the church in Cuba looks like today, ecumenically and non-competitive, and not competing with each other, and what it looks like to you, a collaboration with the church in the U.S.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's more a question. I will, if you come to the second lecture tomorrow, I will answer your question in the tape. I think one of the issues in mission and evangelism is proselytism, no? Which is trying to convert people to a particular denomination, which competes against other traditions. And I think one of the, as I mentioned, one of the interesting features that we have inherited from the patriotic missionaries is, from the end of the 19th century, is precisely their ecumenical vision and commitment. And that was carried out through the 20th century, no? That was the spirit in order to found the Cuban Conference, Council of Churches in 1941. And we see that present still today. But I will mention tomorrow that we have in Cuba currently an influx of many denominations that come in illegally, in the sense that many of the missionaries come with tourist visas, and they start new denominations, creating a lot of divisions within the churches. And precisely, they come with money, no? That's why some of them, I call them mercenaries. They come and they ask you, what is the average salary of a Cuban pastor? $30 per month? Then they come and they say, well, I'll pay you 50, I'll pay you 100 if you work for our ministry, no? So this type of thing is, this type of proselytism through money is creating a lot of divisions, because again, there's a lot of competition against each other, and rather than working in the spirit of John 17, the intercessory prayer of Jesus for his disciples, in order for us to be one, in order for the world to believe. So one of the trends that we're seeing now in Cuba, with the progressive openness of the state towards religion and towards the outside world, we are seeing this influx of fundamentalist groups that are coming in with a lot of money, that are creating a lot of divisions. But again, we will talk more about that tomorrow.
That's a great marketing for tomorrow.
Thank you. I'm learning with you.
Let's all give the Reverend Dr. Carlos Ham applause.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience and for your interest and for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you.